Good afternoon, everyone.
Hello.
I'm Doug Scribner. I'm a partner in the Litigation and Trial Practice Group at Alston & Bird, a member of the management committee at the firm, and I'd like to welcome everybody here from the Pro Bono Roundtable. I'd like to welcome our friends from Koch Industries. I'd like to welcome our friends from Georgia Pacific, and I'd like to welcome everybody here who's a stakeholder in the community. I want to express appreciation to Jenny Kim and Justice Michael Boggs for attending here today, both committed to this very important issue and have been for a long time. As one of the relationship partners for Koch Industries, I've watched Jenny and Mark Holden and all of the work that they've done over the last several years, and it's been terrific to watch. And it's awesome to get an update from Jenny here today, and that's why we have such a big crowd. Earlier this year, I spoke to our firm's pro bono committee and thanked them for all that they did. And I'd like to extend the same thanks to everyone here at the Pro Bono Roundtable, all that you do to help our communities better, the community in which we live. I also want to mention one thing that I think I've recognized for a long time, and that is that the Atlanta legal community is a very close-knit community. The Georgia legal community is a close-knit community, and for those of us who practice a lot outside of Atlanta and outside of Georgia, it takes that to have the full appreciation of how close-knit this legal community is, and it's why we can do the things that we do, including what you're going to hear about today. And I'm certain that you're going to hear about a lot of dots being connected and opportunities for all of us to make a difference, much like the folks who you're going to hear from do a lot more than certainly I do on a daily basis. I'd like to turn it over now to one of the members of the Pro Bono Roundtable and Alston & Bird's Pro Bono partner, Mary Benton.
Great. Thank you, Doug, and hello, everybody. It's good to see everyone this afternoon. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation with my friend Jenny Kim. So as many of y'all know, Jenny is the Deputy General Counsel, Political Law, and Vice President of Public Policy for Koch Public Sector, LLC. That is a mouthful. She's an advisory council lead of the Safe Streets and Second Chances Initiative, leads a Koch partnership with the United States Chamber of Commerce Foundation and SHRM, which is the Society for Human Resource Management. And she was at the forefront of what y'all have read about, the federal bipartisan bill, the First Step Act. It was recently announced also earlier this week that Jenny is going to be honored as one of the women of influence and power in law at the dinner in D.C. this fall. So congratulations to you on that. Jenny has over a decade of experience in criminal justice reform, and she and I have had a lot of wonderful conversations about this, and I've learned a lot just from following her on Twitter and watching what she's done, and Koch Industries and Georgia Pacific have a great history of doing this work. So we're really excited to talk to you today, and thank you so much for being here to share your experience.
Thank you for having me.
Opinions with us. So I want to get started just by asking you a little bit about why Koch Industries is involved in criminal justice reform and why you personally are involved. And I know there's been a number of articles and interviews with you recently in different publications and things. You've been making the rounds, getting the word out about criminal justice. But if those of us who haven't read those, if you could just share with us.
So Charles Koch has an abiding passion for second chances and for removing barriers to opportunities for all. And I think key to all of that is that it's about looking at all the different barriers, the 46,000 collateral consequences, the 1 in 3 Americans with a criminal record, the fact that we have 2 million in our prisons right now approximately, and then on top of it, 4.5 million on probation and parole. And so you add all of that, factor it together, and then you look at our labor markets right now and our businesses, and there's over 7 million open jobs in America. We don't have the labor force to fill them. And so in terms of inclusiveness and diversity and businesses needing workers to work in their on their businesses and to fill jobs and keep productivity going, we really have to look at it from all the different angles, from all the collateral consequences, the barriers of opportunity, and these people are coming out, right? I think the one stat, it goes from 95% to 97% of people in prison are coming out. They're returning to our communities, whether we like it or not, and 77% of them recidivate, which means they go back in the next 3 years because they are blocked from housing, jobs, voting, getting licenses to perform their profession. And so these are the things that sort of happen. And then on a personal level for me, I think it's just meeting these people and then understanding that they have a name, they have dreams, they have aspirations, and somewhere along the way they lost their way. They probably didn't have parents like mine who were very strict. I wasn't allowed to be out of the house after 5 p.m. I grew up in New York City during the 80s and 90s, so when the 10 o'clock news came on and people asked, do you know where your kids are now? I was just like, why are people asking this silly question? Like, I'm here at home. So those are the things that sort of happen. And, what is fascinating about all of this is how much of an ecosystem it is and how much of it has been the kitchen drawer that everyone's just dumped every societal problem thinking they can get away from it, right? So workforce, healthcare, mental health and substance abuse, education, like, I don't know how to figure this out, so let's just dump it into this kitchen drawer called criminal justice and hope they can take it. And the reality is it wasn't created for all of this, right? Just as I was not created to eat red velvet cake every night, I was created for famine, not feasting. It's the same thing with the criminal justice system. It's really about keeping us safe and about making sure that we only lock away the people we're afraid of, not everyone we're mad at, which is unfortunately what it's become now.
Well, I think when you talk to some people about who is in our prison population and who makes up the people who are incarcerated, you oftentimes get a lot of negative assumptions about who those people are.
Yes.
And I know you've had the opportunity to speak with people and to meet the inmates and have a different perception. Can you share your experience with us and maybe change some of those perceptions?
So there's a company in Arizona called Televerde. They do direct business-to-business marketing, and they train the women in Perryville and help them get jobs after it's all said and done. And they are sort of very committed to this because the person running Televerde originally created that company to help women in prison. And the women incarceration population is just skyrocketing. And most of those women in prison, frankly, have kids. And those kids then get placed in foster care. So again, none of the system is separately put. You can't separate it out. It's all interconnected. Well, so we went there I think at the end of May, end of April, beginning of May. That's where I had my first In-N-Out burger, actually, in Phoenix. Sorry, In-N-Out. So that's where we went into that prison. And what struck all of us as we talked to all the women and as they created these beautiful pieces of art, and they're all in my office kind of hung, and I post them on my Instagram site as well, is that most of them, number one, were in there for drug addiction, and they had gone through some personal pain in their life, and everything sort of went off the rails, and they didn't really have a support system that was going to help them get back on the rails. But none of them were a danger to society, and they were all extremely motivated and eager to get back out and contribute. And the nice thing about the Televerde program is that in conjunction with their 501c3, Arrowette Foundation, they provide all these wraparound services. So a lot of the women in there were getting financial planning. They're making much more than minimum wage. So a lot of them were going out with at least $25,000 in savings. Most in-prison jobs pay anywhere from 5 cents to 95 cents an hour. Can you do anything with that? Bazooka bubblegum, anyone? I don't think it's even that cheap anymore. So that's the sort of thing that financial planning, housing, and then a support system. They know that there's these women they can go to. They know that if they get into trouble again with mental health, these are the folks they need to go to, and they just support one another. And that's the sort of bond that you see. I think, traditionally with Law and Order being such an incredibly long franchise that it is, I think people think of, everyone in prison being like that, and the reality is it's not that. And then similarly, when we went to visit San Quentin, which is on multi-million-dollar waterfront property in Northern California, actually they have to maintain the Spanish Moor architecture facade, otherwise the developers will come in, and that way they're historical landmarks so that the prison can continue to be there. But there's sharks in that water, right? That's why California built most of their prisons around the bay, because it'd be hard to escape. But nowadays, it's multi-million-dollar property. But anyway, the Last Mile is a coding program that's been in existence for over a decade. One of the entities that we work with, Stand Together Foundation, gave them a huge grant and to expand there. And you meet all the men, and they're doing these incredible things with their different coding programs. And honestly, some of it could be applicable to the things that we need, like, for example, mentorship programs, connecting people, kids to mentors online, also sort of developing sort of an ecosystem, a LinkedIn focused on African-American young men and young boys. And so all these things, it's interesting. I was like, oh, I think the 100 Black men could use this. And they're like, who's that? And so East Coast and West Coast in this country, and clearly I was like, we don't talk. But those are the sort of people, and they have one of them had 4 older sisters. A couple of them were from New York City. I said, what are you doing all the way out here? And they were willing to share their stories. And so it's the pride factor that they've never been able to be proud of something, but now they have something to be proud of, just as a way, like, despite all our frustrations every day, we have something to be proud of, right? We're all proud to work for the employer that we have. We're proud to be associated with the family members that we have. And if something goes wrong, there is someone that we can actually talk to. For the folks that are in prison, before they went in, most of the time, they never had a first chance. So, like, when they come out in prison, having the education, having the emotional soft skill support, having that training, having that dialogue, it's really, really important to them. And I think for them, it's really important that Holly and I, my colleague Holly Warden's here, like, we separated and we were able to meet with all of the men there, and also know that they have a for-profit business as well at the Last Mile. And if anyone's interested, they're interested in more web projects that they would like to do as well.
Fantastic. And it really is, as you said, kind of those interpersonal relationships and learning people's story and knowing where you kind of got off the track and how you can fix it. So I think another assumption that people might have about the prison population is that once you go to prison, you might be there for an extremely long time or maybe even forever and spend the rest of your life there. And we know that's not the case, that 700,000 people are returned annually to families and communities. But then, as you mentioned, the recidivism rate is extremely high. So I think you shared that 70% of those will be back in prison within 3 years.
Yes.
And so what, in your opinion, can be done to impact that statistic and bring it down so that those who have served their time can reunite with their families and be contributing members of society?
I think the most important thing is, number one, and this is what we're working on with our Safe Streets and Second Chances initiative in Florida, Texas, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, and at some point it will expand to 3 other states as well. But the policy changes have to happen at the executive branch level with the governors, and the different agency heads have to talk to each other, particularly labor, workforce, DMV, transportation, corrections. They all have to, Health and Human Services, they all have to talk to each other. And then on the research side, what really works, what doesn't work, needs to be sort of finalized, and that knowledge needs to be shared. At the same time, the ecosystem that is the reentry world is very, very fragmented. There are so many incredible people, like the folks in this room, who are doing so many good things, Georgia Justice Project, but in every state there's all this stuff going on. And then sometimes the very, like, faith-based businesses are doing things too. And so, for example, here at the Atlanta Office of Public Defender, they actually partner informally with many businesses and try to get people employed. And we were able to hook them up with CKS Packaging locally here, who's a very committed second chance employer as well. I think there needs to be more and more in-prison education and rehabilitation. Reentry needs to happen from day one. But we also need to take all this learning and apply it from the moment of arrest. And we need to, like, figure out, like, what does this person need? How did this person get into trouble? Because once someone goes into prison, that is like literally graduate school for criminals. And if they were totally, like, sweet and innocent before, they're not going to come out sweet and innocent anymore. And it takes at least 10 years to rebuild your life after prison. And so it's really important that we sort of think about all these sort of moving factors constantly and kind of bring it there. And the states that sort of do it well, like Michigan, where it's like 550 businesses have partnered with the corrections head, and they're all training inside the prisons. We really, really have to sort of figure out how to take that model everywhere.
And what have you seen, and what does the data show if we aren't doing that? Like, why is the recidivism rate so high once people get out if they haven't had those support systems?
So 46,000 plus collateral consequences. That means no housing. You end up homeless, no job, because very few people are going to be willing to hire you. And look, even if you remove the, do you have a criminal conviction question there, the background check at the very end, because most offers are conditional, it's going to be very hard to sort of get there. And that's why we're working with Dave's Killer Bread Foundation to really sort of help businesses figure out how to screen and how to figure out, what takes it to make it successful, right? Because the Society for Human Resource Management, that partnership, we've put out the toolkit so the businesses know what issues to spot for. The next step is the implementation. How can supervisors do this well? How can HR do this better? How can we sort of swallow our fears and our preset assumptions? And that's what's been interesting about all of this, is that you start questioning every assumption that you've had, and why do you think this, right? And should you continue to think this is the other thing, especially as you meet more and more of the people with criminal records, especially because it's so easy to get into trouble, right? I think we're going to work on a driver's license restoration campaign soon. But for example, there's more than 5,000 federal criminal laws, 300,000 federal criminal regulations. Each state has at least 1,800 state criminal laws. Each county, and there's over 3,000 in America, have their own criminal ordinances. You take all of that into account, then you have all the great, like, super highway tickets. I've gotten into trouble myself on those. And I mean, I pay it, right? It's just money, right? But for a lot of the folks, it's not just money, and they can't afford it. And a lot of the governments have used driver license fees and fines and fees as, like, on paper to balance their books so they look like they're, fiscally responsible. The reality is the collection's not there. And so those are the things that data has helped us sort of derive and say, like, we need to do better about this. And so that's why if you don't have driver's license, you don't have a job, and you don't have housing, you're already set up, you're going to give up, because it's already so hard, right? After prison, so much has changed once you come out, and you're trying to adjust to those changes. On top of it, you're trying to survive. I mean, just think about how, like, Marie Kondo has, like, every organization system in the world. Why is she making so much money? Because she's selling us this organization system that we think is going to work for us too. But half the time we fall off the wagon. It's the same concept. All these folks, like, they've got to keep up with so much. And on top of it, we're adding up another layer of, like, the government's telling you what to do as well. And so that's why it's just this constant sort of cycle in, cycle out, unless, we get the in-prison education programs. But I think it's also important to train the government employees who are dealing with these folks, probation, corrections officers, to have the same opportunities, because then I think they will be more understanding, and they will sort of view things differently.
You mentioned Michigan as one of the states that's doing really well in this area. What are some of the other states? What are best practices? What can we learn from what's working, in your opinion?
Everybody just needs to start doing in-prison education and figuring out how to demonstrate that it makes sense. South Carolina is doing very well. So is pretty much Ohio. Texas in certain spots is doing pretty well. So those are the states that sort of John Wetzel in Pennsylvania is doing a great job as well. Kentucky, Corrections head Secretary Tilley is doing great things as well. But everybody's sort of learning from each other, and that's why this new Council on Criminal Justice that's just been formed, they're trying to share more of the knowledge, because everyone is, like, literally working on their issue and trying to survive day to day. So it's really hard to pull your head up and try to figure out, where to connect all the dots. I mean, recently, Secretary Tilley and I texted back and forth because I saw something that he tweeted out about a business in Kentucky. I said, hey, do you know if they hire people with criminal records? He's like, oh my God, I totally forgot to ask them that question. So he's like, let me go back, and they're thinking about it, and they're trying to do it. And the way you do this is start with one, and then you talk to other businesses that have done it successfully and figure out, how to mentor with them, get resources from them, and also remember that you're never going to get to 100%. Somewhere along the range of 80% retention is a really, really good number.
So in terms of businesses and what businesses can do to have an impact in this area, first of all, why should for-profit businesses even care about this? And then second, what can they do about it?
So for-profit businesses should care because there is a way where the Venn diagram meets. There's economic benefit for both sides. The business community has been missing from this conversation for a long time, and that's why I think you can have government, nonprofits, and the education system sort of constantly churn, but you need businesses as part of this equation because we are all part of the community, and we need to make sure our communities are safe, that our employees are stable, and that they're going to do well. And so in a lot of pockets, I'm going to go back to Michigan, unfortunately, but in Grand Rapids, Michigan, Butterball, Cascades Engineering, and a group of the businesses there, they created their own employee assistance program so their employees can take benefit of it. The thing to remember about the people with criminal records population generally is that when you hire them, you also have to remember that they have family issues that they're dealing with as well. So you sort of have to look at them holistically. It's not just hiring sort of a random person off the street. and they're just going to magically kind of all make it happen. You sort of have to support them both emotionally and sometimes helping them navigate the entire sort of social service spectrum as well. So another company in Cincinnati that does it really well is Nehemiah Manufacturing, and they have 2 social workers on staff instead of HR people, and they have really wraparound services, and they have a nurse practitioner on staff, they have a dietitian come regularly, and they really sort of try to help all these folks, and they also take photographs of all the kids, and I'm sure they get all the proper releases. I'm not going to even ask. But that's how they use to advertise their baby wipes, like Boogie wipes and all the sort of like orphaned P&G products and things like that. So that's how they keep all. But what really works for the small to medium-sized businesses is that the owner and the senior management knows everybody's name. So CKS Packaging is about 3,200 across the United States. They work with Dallas, Kansas City, North Carolina, and here in Atlanta, and literally like everybody knows everybody's name. Like and I know that seems like so random, but just being able to call them by their names is a big, big deal for these folks, and they feel truly valued. And I think that's true of all of us. I mean, I remember in the beginning of my career when my supervisor knew my name, I was very, very gratified. So, still gratified.
So, you mentioned Dave's Killer Bread a little bit earlier.
Yes.
Will you share with us that story about that company and then what they're doing and how they're kind of at the forefront?
So
of this?
now they're part of Flowers Corporation because they were sold a couple of years ago. But Dave's Killer Bread started because the owner's brother had sort of a lot of issues, and so he was regularly in and out of prison. He needed a job, and so they started to decide they would bake the best bread ever, and that's how they got started, kind of baking bread and they asked no questions, no background check, nothing. It is an amazing facility. They could automate it more, they admit, but they've sort of stopped on the automation to ensure that people have jobs in the community there. But they don't ask any questions. They get started. They work, and that's how they got started. And then they realized we need more businesses to really commit to this, and that's why they started the foundation on the other end of the spectrum. And talking to them, it's really about helping everybody figure out, and they're trying to put together a workbook of how to hire, how to think about this, how to screen, how to figure out where all the social services are. And actually, we're also working with them to see if we can Google map out all the resources across the country, whether it be mental health services, et cetera, including businesses that hire if they want to be public about it. But it's still hard, right? Because it's like in Kansas, Zephyr, which has in-prison welding programs and certification programs, about 40-plus companies hire from that program. They're very happy about it. Most of them don't want to come out and say anything. And I'm just like, wait a minute, you're manufacturing. Sort of get it if you're retail, but you're manufacturing. Who's going to have an issue with that? But there's still that. And so this whole change has to happen culturally, structurally, and programmatically. Culturally, we've got to have more of an open mind around a lot of things. I know the buzzword nowadays is unconscious bias. And so we've got to figure out what our unconscious biases are and move past them, number one. Structural, there's a lot of statutory and government structures that are in place, literally, I would say, from the 1930s, and nobody actually ever really reformed them. And so they're just kind of built upon drywall, and it's all cruddy. So it needs to be broken down and rebuilt. And then finally, programmatically, I think we need to really figure out what works, what doesn't work, and some places have really sort of, and we at actually Koch Industries, and particularly at Georgia Pacific and Guardian, have decided to become more intentional about, finding, screening, hiring and retaining people with criminal records. And in fact, the outreach from all the different reentry providers has been great. So like Indiana and Texas and Florida, and sort of being in discussions with them to try to figure out how can we do this successfully.
Well, that's great. And you mentioned what Koch Industries and Georgia Pacific are doing in some ways. And can you expand on that a little bit more in terms of the Safe Streets, Second Chances, pro bono work, and other initiatives?
Sure. So in addition to the hiring, getting talent back to work with the SHRM initiative and the Safe Streets and Second Chances, we also have our entire strong in-house counsel working with our panel firms, and our pro bono co-chairs are here. Hi, Jeremy. Hi, Matt. Hi, Dave. Nashe. And they're here and kind of working to galvanize our sort of legal expertise as well as our non-legal expertise as well to get expungements and driver's licenses restored, and wherever else there needs to be services and housing, and kind of figuring out what the right programs are. But the more we can do all of this and more of corporate America can be more involved. And I know after meeting with, for example, with Verizon's GC a couple of months ago, actually early this year in January, with Mark Holden, they've decided to make expungement their thing too. So those are sort of things that we can kind of start one at a time. But while that is going on at the same time, because expungements do increase the likelihood of someone getting a job by 45%, according to the University of Michigan, we also have to continue pressing on all the legislative advocacy and policies to change and clean slate and more data and transparency around that. And that's a legislative function, but it's also an executive branch function because we have to make sure it gets implemented too. Because every time a data bill passes, everyone's like, yay. Every time a clean slate bill passes, everyone's, yay. Okay, that's great. Now we need to go figure out if the infrastructure's there to make it happen, and the talent's there too, frankly, in the government to make it happen as well.
Well, speaking of that, you were involved in the First Step Act and that legislation. Will you tell us a little bit about what that is and what you see its kind of success being in the future?
So there was another op-ed recently, I think literally yesterday in the Washington Examiner, that Mark Holden published about how the Bureau of Prisons needs to be renamed to the Bureau of Rehabilitation and maybe moved even altogether to HHS, the Health and Human Resources. Because there's, I think, Attorney General Barr just temporarily appointed someone from his days in the 90s to be the head of the Bureau of Prisons. So the First Step Act was really this. It started out as mainly a prison and reentry reform bill. Then it had some sentencing revisions, some of it retroactive, some of it not, but really focused on how do we make the 200,000 plus in the current federal system better, more reintegrated back into society, give them a fighting chance, as opposed to just say, hi, here, I'm leaving you here at this bus stop. See you later, alligator. Yeah, with $20 and nothing else. And so that's how that got started. And so it's supposed to bring more of a refined and scientific risk assessment. It's supposed to allow more providers like Prison Fellowship and others to be able to go in and provide more education and training and learning. Because I think right now in the federal prisons they get crocheting classes, which I mean. That's lovely. I still can't crochet properly. But it's not going to actually get you a real living that will get you a job and housing. And so that's what that was really, really focused on. That's happening really slowly, unfortunately, because we just got that director, and now hopefully it's going to move along a little more quickly. But that's what the First Step Act is, the first step. So at the federal level, we envision that, plus then creating a federal clean slate, and revising the clemency process because it's too sort of built in the DOJ, and so make sure that it's in another body altogether, and that the White House and the President can actually exercise the clemency as well, and then have better sort of integration with the Office of Administrative Courts, which is interesting. Is that once everybody leaves the Bureau of Prisons, then they're sent over to AO, the Office of Administrative Courts, and their probation and parole, like what resources are out there, how to do the reentry courts. Those are the things that it sort of all needs to kind of work together, and where the federal defender is actually located too, how to work together. And so that's all the stuff that the First Step Act is supposed to redo, and then we're supposed to do a second step, but we shall see, because I think we're already in the presidential re-election season.
That's right. So, well, there's a lot of businesses and legal folks represented here today that are all involved in the roundtable, and a lot of people who are doing criminal justice reform work. So what advice would you have for the folks that are on the roundtable, if you're not quite to get started, or to, what's kind of the next thing that you see in Georgia and in Atlanta?
So in Georgia, everyone's given us lots of advice the last 2 days. Clean slate, legislation, I think doing more partnerships with businesses. And I think we met with the Atlanta Public Defender's Office yesterday and trying to figure out how to kind of create that ecosystem sort of more vibrantly. If, as outside lawyers for a lot of businesses, if you could figure out, what is the policy about hiring people with criminal records even? Because I think most of the time, most businesses have no idea. They may not have a policy, or they may have a policy from 20 years ago that banned all of it, because that's where everyone traditionally started. So figure out, how do you get that policy taken down and then start slowly about thinking about, okay, so where do we feel comfortable taking a risk on hiring someone with a criminal record? Because I think everyone's heard Mark Holden talk about this all the time. There are lots of people there have been people at Koch who came in without a criminal record and kind of left with a criminal record. So, hiring anyone and retaining anyone is a risk. And so you sort of have to factor all of that in as you do it. So doing pro bono work, doing, just mentoring youth. I think at-risk youth is going to be a big deal. That's not a technical legal thing, but they don't have anyone in their lives. And just to know that someone is there is really, really important. Someone to just listen, right, when they vent. It doesn't have to be you have to provide all this like wisdom and, Andy Griffith kind of advice, but just even listening is a big deal. And then figuring out how to integrate things more and where you see, opportunities. Work with people in the community. And I would recommend, actually, if you can, go visit a prison. Because that just changes your mindset completely. And it changes your assumptions about what you think people in prison are like, right? Yeah, there's, in San Quentin is where all the death penalty folks are. There's one side of that. But then there's like everyone else who they really want to rebuild their lives. They are committed to doing it, and they're trying really hard not to make a mistake. But they really want people to know that, and they really want people to know that they've gotten way past their past, but they don't feel like anyone's giving them a chance. And just visiting and talking with them and just giving a human face and knowing that people on the outside care about them, that means a lot to them.
So before we open it for question and answer, I wanted to ask for you to share just kind of one story, one experience that's really had an impact on you in this area and over like the last decade or so.
So actually, when we visited the women's prison at Tela Verde in Perryville, Arizona, we got to chat with a small group of women, and one of them, we just got chatting. I have gone back to reading children's books. I know that's really weird. But like Frog and Toad and Amelia Bedelia, because
I love Frog and Toad.
Yes, Frog and Toad is great. Because children's books sort of bring the essence all down to what like the most essential lessons. And in addition to Frog and Toad, Amelia Bedelia, because you can always say the same things but mean totally different things. And that's what I've learned in working on criminal justice is that, oh yeah, you're totally confident you're coming out of a meeting thinking you agreed on the same things, and you realize, no, we have totally. When you say dress the chicken, like it's a totally different meaning that the two of you can't come to, and so like reconfirming. But the women in there, those were the things that they cared about, and they were like, oh, that's my favorite book. And you just sort of encounter people who just kind of think about things like that you do, that you like, and it's just a natural conversation. It's not like you're in prison and I'm not, and I'm coming in and I'm going to help you and be your angel. No, that's not the way you need to view it. It's just you're having a conversation with them. And then the other experience actually is learning to accept something, thinking about the other side. And I told the story this morning about in Hutchinson, Kansas, there's a party ribbon and balloon maker that has a training facility inside the prison there. And somebody made this beautiful big pink ribbon and then gave it to me. And I remember thinking, like, what do I do with this? Like, I don't even like ribbons. But then I realized it's about him and his pride that he actually feels like he can do something for me. And so I accepted it and I hung it in my office and it's still there.
Again, just the common thread of
Yes.
humanity that runs through all of it. So, well, I do want to open it up for questions. If anyone has any questions for Jenny,
I'll direct them all to Justice Boggs because he knows more than anyone else, and he's been a mentor to me on this. So,
hello. My name is Kenya Johnson, and I represent the Fulton County Solicitor General's Office. Our elected prosecutor is Keith Gamage, and I wanted to follow up on some of the things you mentioned about working with the business community. So here in Atlanta, just last week, we had a job fair in conjunction with the Atlanta Metro Chamber, where we had over 50 employers prepared to give away 1,200 jobs, second chance jobs. They gave over 400 jobs away on the spot. That was in partnership with the Georgia Justice Project, and Ms. Naja and her pro bono group helped to do some of the expungement work, because we're finding that in Georgia's booming economy, employers need workers as much as workers need jobs. And so partnering with them, the studies and the research show that people that were formerly incarcerated have some of the best work ethics that you could have. They know how to get up in the morning, they're motivated, they've worked for cheaper, and they want to stay out of jail and stay on the right side of parole. So tell me this, with over 4,600 elected prosecutors in the country, there are less than 1% which are minority prosecutors. What are your thoughts on having the prosecution to reflect the communities that they serve so that they can be more sensitive to cultural needs and consider that in prosecution?
So I think the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative is currently working on that and kind of trying to come up with a progressive prosecutor sort of a list of principles. And I think it's important to be cognizant of the community's needs, but most prosecutors are elected, so it's really up to the electorate in that community to really be thinking about this and be forceful about it and elect the person that they feel best represents this sort of progressive sort of notion. And that's happening a lot thanks to Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and that's something that they work on quite a bit. I think, the demographics of this country are changing, so that hopefully will come with time as people get more educated and people understand this more, because I think for a long time prosecutorial elections, I think people just checked the box, honestly. Most people didn't even know who they were. I know when I voted in New York City for the New York State judges, I was like, who is this? And who's this party? Because literally you turn the knobs. But now I think because there's more of awareness with Chan Zuckerberg and also Marian Krinsky's organization, Fair and Just Prosecution, I think you're going to see that change. I think, it is the human condition to want change overnight. We're big on instant gratification. That's why we have these smartphones, right? But you don't lose weight overnight, right? And so you don't get in shape overnight. And so this thing is it's been over 10 years since we've worked on it, and now it's gotten traction, but it's almost like a diet and exercise plan. You have to be persistent and kind of committed to thinking about it. And even when you fall off the wagon, you can't beat yourself and regress, right? Don't eat that gallon of ice cream just because you've regressed. Make sure you get back on the bandwagon. And hopefully with the structural, cultural changes that are coming slowly but surely and steadily, that's gonna enable the prosecutorial committee to also reflect the communities they represent. Thank you.
Other questions tomorrow?
Hi, I'm Tamara Caldas. I'm the pro bono partner at Kilpatrick Townsend. I wonder what your thoughts are on the role of, probably most states have issues around private probation, private parole, privately run prisons and jails, and sometimes even the subcontractors within them for mental health care, where there's an incentive, for example, to keep someone longer or to violate their parole or whatever. What's your thinking in terms of where does that fit into criminal justice reform? I'm just interested in your thoughts on the issue.
Number one, the criminal justice system is a failed government program, right? So number one, we need to shrink the system down, from top to bottom. I think the thing with private prisons having practiced government contract law once upon a time is that the incentives are just all sort of not there in the right way in those contracts. And I think we saw this with the Affordable Health Care Act too. Even in the federal government, the website was a mess because the way that our traditional government procurement systems are there and created, it's a big problem. But I would worry about not just the private prisons and sort of the private procurers of things, but also, I think people are sort of seeing, for example, body cameras are a panacea to everything. Technology is a panacea to everything. Well, nobody's thinking about who owns that data. I mean, you really have to think about in the government contracting process who fundamentally is owning that data, because if the city or the state doesn't own that data, then where does that all go? And right now, we don't even have data. So the private prison's not working and how effective they are, we don't have the data to show one or the other, and also incentives are just not aligned. But I'm sure you've seen that most of the major national banks have decided to stop financing private prisons. The interesting thing is that Zephyr, who builds a lot of in-training facilities in Leavenworth, they can't get a bank to give them a loan. So they had to invest, find the collateral to spend $1 million whole to build those facilities to increase the capacity in Leavenworth in the Kansas prisons, because banks won't banks won't give you a loan because there's no collateral, as far as they're concerned.
Hi, I'm Ann Colton. I'm with the Georgia Justice Project, and Jenny's introduction could have been our introduction. But since we're in Georgia, I just wanted to give a little context, since we are in Georgia, that we have the highest rate of correctional control in the entire country, and yet we're one of 10 states that don't allow expungement of convictions, no matter how long ago they occurred. And so that's 4.2 million people in Georgia who have a lifetime barrier to employment and housing. And so we do work a lot with the Solicitor General in Fulton County, Keith Gamage, and he's doing all he can to help people get expungements. But no matter how progressive the prosecutors are, if the law doesn't change, there's only a very small fraction of that population that can be helped at all. If anyone is interested, we launched the Second Chance for Georgia campaign that's aimed at bringing together nonprofits, faith community businesses to change the conversation from a social justice issue to a workforce development issue. And so if any of you would like to support that with doing legal research or introducing us to elected officials or elected prosecutors, especially if you live in Cobb County, we would welcome your support. And there's 4 of us here from Georgia Justice, so come see us. We have a lot of information we'd be happy to share. And
that'd be terrific.
Welcome your involvement.
And you're getting support from the chambers, right?
We have talked to the chambers, and I think they're in the process of sort of polling their members about this issue. So a lot of other states have passed with support of the chambers. Sometimes the sole driver behind it is the chamber.
Well, Kentucky, the chamber is very, very forceful there, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's our goal as well.
I got to go check with Alan Richardson. He's going to kill me if I do it without him. So.
Hello, Julie Straw with Reimagine ATL, and we're working with Opportunity Youth and also with alternative and non-traditional schools and doing a lot of workforce development, especially around film and media industries here. And I was wondering, in addition to prevention with youth and really this mentorship and training and then actual job placement, what are some additional ways that we can be involved as a community and engage the community for prevention efforts, especially around like advocating and changing laws? We're seeing our students impacted by mandatory minimums and going in and out, and a lot of, just disjointed systems between trying the students with tribunals in the schools and then things being taken away, and all of a sudden now, they're 17, now 18 and being tried as adults. So are there any initiatives or progress that you've seen with changing some of the laws so they're not being going into the system due to those changes? And is there anything in Georgia that you're aware of that we can stand behind and do more advocacy work and prevention work as a community?
So I do mostly adult works. That's mainly my focus. I'm happy to find out more. And Georgia Justice Project probably knows of any sort of juvenile. But I think the biggest barrier you're encountering, frankly, is the fact that the system's so fragmented. So someone has to almost come in and map out the entire juvenile system and figure out where there's a breakdown, and then go to the legislature, get that fixed, and then find a champion within the executive branch and the governor's office to get those fixed too. You almost need to look at other states who have done it successfully and see how that gets done. You don't want to create a commission for the sake of creating a commission, because that's usually where things go to die. But you do want to figure out like how to map all of that out. And there's resources. I think Pew does a lot of juvenile justice stuff. And they've been on the map for it for a long time. And I think talking to someone at Pew would be helpful. Pew's launching a lot of different things, as a matter of fact, for across the entire criminal justice spectrum.
And I'll also say on that, a lot of us in the room do work with Georgia Appleseed and with AVLF and Atlanta Legal Aid and Georgia Legal Services Project. And I think a lot of those are now coming together to talk with Department of Revenue and DFACS and stuff on the in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension issue on behavioral health and wellness in schools. So you're looking at the underlying issue of why a kid is acting out as opposed to then just punishing and things like that. So that conversation is going on in Georgia, and Georgia Appleseed just published guides for parents whose children have behavioral issues or learning differences, and it's on the website, and they're doing educational venues like forums across the state and stuff like that. So that is, and we can connect too. Love to do that. And Justice Boggs, do you have anything else to add on that?
I was going to ask Jenny a question. First, thank you for being here, and thank you for the leadership that you and Koch and Mark and others have provided to so many nonprofits, but also to specified states that have really been engaged in some real holistic efforts at criminal justice reform, Georgia, of course, being one of those. There have been ongoing conversations and meetings that I've been in across the country about sort of this pivot, moving away from some of the low-hanging fruit, if you will, of criminal justice reform, diverting people into accountability court programs, for example, and pivoting towards the mental health population. And so as my question to you would be, do you sense a pivot in the criminal justice arena generally, nationally, since much of this is funded by MIOCRA funding out of Congress and is so dependent on that funding? Do you sense a movement towards a more holistic consideration of those returning citizens that need wraparound mental health services in the community? We talk about all of the other barriers, but of course that is a significant barrier as well. And I wonder if you might speak briefly about the challenges facing states in enacting meaningful criminal justice reform that includes all of the essential components to ensure success.
So the mental health and substance abuse treatment and the wraparound services associated with that is probably the thing that has confounded most people. And so Judge Leifman in Miami-Dade, Florida, has his model that everyone, I think, sort of touts. Pew is probably going to launch a project later this fall, sort of focused on 3 states to test out a couple of different models and see, where those go, because they've gotten the medical community involved as well. And the Philanthropy Roundtable has a staff person kind of devoted to these issues. So the pivot is starting to happen, and I think it's also mainly driven by the fact that mental health issues, period, are becoming a bigger and bigger issue just generally in the country, right? Loneliness is equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. All the change and the pressures are sort of, hanging over all workplace issues, put aside the criminal justice. So from that perspective, from a huge societal, I think there's a pivot going on there. And I think even we are sort of looking at, what sort of resources do we have internally for our employees as, people go through changes in, various parts of their lives. So it's moving. Again, that world is very fragmented too. And actually, one of my colleagues and I are supposed to visit some facility down in Dallas that is doing things really well and trying to figure out, how do we bring some of that to Wichita and to some of the other places. But that is the thing that has confounded even the best EAP, employee assistance programs that are like collectively funded by the different corporations and businesses in the community. That is still sort of confounded everyone and how to navigate that system, right? And how to not have the hospitals look like hospitals, the mental health institutions. That's something Judge Leifman is very interested in design. So it feels like a home. It feels almost like this space to chat so that people, when they come out, they can reintegrate back into their communities rather than feel like, okay, I've now been let out of the ICU into. So there's a lot of different elements that go into that, including design, which don't ask me to design anything. That's not my comparative advantage. But so hopefully with Philanthropy Roundtable, because that's the assembly of some of the wealthiest philanthropists in the country who are sort of looking at this issue now more seriously and holistically. And so hopefully something will come out of it. Because actually in October, we're going out there at the Philanthropy Roundtable conference and starting that conversation and then being part of the conversation. Because what did someone say? If you're not at the table, you're going to be the meal.
Very good. So, well, we are at the 4:30 mark, and so I just want to say thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
For being with us.
Thank you very much.
And on your chair, I don't know, for those of you who do not currently follow Jenny on Twitter, get out your phones right now and follow her. And over the years, I know you've shared wonderful resources with me and books, and my kids and I go through Crime a Day.
Yes.
That new book that's out.
How to Become a Federal Criminal.
How to Become a Federal Criminal with all the federal laws, and there's illustrations, and it's really funny.
But don't try them. Please don't try them.
Yeah, you don't want to do them.
No.
But there's a list of resources that Jenny's provided us for y'all to get involved in. I hope you will all stay for the reception that we're going to have, and we can continue this wonderful conversation. So
thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And this is from
Oh,
us.
my. Thank you.
On the Roundtable. So the food is coming out, and the bar will be open.